Welcome to Mr. Crimeshow. Tonight, I'm bringing you 8 real true crime cases, each one filled with chilling details and haunting twists. Paired with rain sounds and a black screen, this video is designed to let you listen comfortably in the dark, whether you're winding down, studying, or falling asleep. Settle in and let these stories unfold. If you enjoy this experience, be sure to subscribe and share where you're listening from in the comments. The Copelands, a dark chapter in American crime. In the quiet farming community of rural Missouri, an elderly couple named Ray and Faye Copeland committed acts so shocking that they would become known as America's oldest serial killers. Their story began not with violence, but with a lifetime of petty crime that slowly evolved into something unimaginably darker. By the time law enforcement discovered the truth, 5 innocent men had lost their lives due to the actions of these seemingly ordinary grandparents. Ray Copeland was born in 1917 and had spent most of his adult life engaging in various fraudulent schemes, particularly involving livestock and bad checks. By the 1980s, at 70 years old, he had perfected a pattern of criminal behavior that had earned him multiple arrests, but had never resulted in significant consequences. His wife Faye, born in 1921, had long been his companion in both life and crime, though the extent of her involvement would later become a matter of intense legal debate. The couple lived on a modest farm near Mooresville, Missouri, about 90 miles northeast of Kansas City, in a rural area where neighbors were few and privacy was abundant. Their home appeared unremarkable from the outside, but it would become the center of one of the most calculated and cold-blooded criminal schemes in American history. The Copelands had 6 children together, and by all outward appearances, they seemed like typical rural grandparents living out their golden years on the family farm. The criminal enterprise that would lead to multiple deaths began as an evolution of Ray's long-standing pattern of check fraud. However, this time, the scheme was far more sophisticated and infinitely more deadly. Ray would travel to homeless shelters in nearby cities, particularly the Victory Mission in Springfield, Missouri, where he would approach transient men with promises of steady work and a place to stay. These vulnerable individuals, often struggling with alcoholism, unemployment, or other hardships, were easy targets for Ray's offers of employment buying cattle at livestock auctions. The plan was methodical and carefully orchestrated. Once Ray convinced a homeless man to work for him, he would bring the individual back to the farm, where Faye would often have a warm meal waiting. The men were told they would be helping Ray buy cattle because he claimed to be hard of hearing and needed assistance with bidding at auctions. Ray would then take these men to nearby towns where they would open post office boxes and checking accounts using money provided by the Copelands. After obtaining starter checks, the transients would accompany Ray to various livestock auctions throughout the region, where they would purchase cattle using checks from accounts that had insufficient funds to cover the purchases. The cattle would be immediately resold for cash, and the Copelands would pocket the profits before the fraudulent checks could bounce, and before authorities could trace the transactions back to them. However, the most sinister part of the plan was yet to come. To eliminate any potential witnesses to their fraudulent activities, the Copelands would not let these men survive after the transactions. Each victim was killed, and investigators later determined a firearm from the Copeland home had been used. The planning involved in these acts was chilling in its thoroughness. Faye kept detailed records of all banking transactions, including dates and amounts of deposits and withdrawals for each victim. Perhaps the most damning evidence against Faye was a handwritten list found inside a Polaroid camera case during the police search. The list contained the names of several men who had worked for the Copelands, with notations of either back or X next to each name. Next to the names of the 3 confirmed deceased victims were X marks, suggesting a systematic method of tracking which men had returned and which had been eliminated. This list would become crucial evidence in proving Faye's active participation in the conspiracy. The first victim was Paul J. Coward. a 21-year-old man from Dardanelle, Arkansas, who lost his life due to the actions of the Copelands in May 1986. John W. Freeman, 27, from Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the second victim, meeting his fate in December 1986. Jimmy Dale Harvey, also 27, from Springfield, Missouri, became the third victim in 1987. Dennis K. Murphy from Normal, Illinois, and Wayne Warner were the final two victims, both losing their lives in 1988. The Copelands went to extraordinary lengths to distance themselves from their victims. They kept the men's belongings, including clothing and luggage, stored in a guest bedroom closet. In a particularly unsettling detail that would later emerge during the trial, Faye had used some of the victims' clothing to make quilts, a fact that would horrify investigators and the public alike. The couple's criminal enterprise might have continued indefinitely, if not for one man who managed to escape their deadly scheme. Jack McCormick, a 57-year-old recovering alcoholic, had been recruited by Ray from the Victory Mission in Springfield in July 1989. Like the others before him, McCormick was brought to the farm and instructed to open a post office box and checking account in Brookfield, Missouri. However, McCormick's experience took a different turn when he made a disturbing discovery while walking behind the barn on August 6, 1989. He observed what appeared to be human remains partially buried in the ground. When he returned to the house, Faye seemed upset and told him that neither she nor Ray wanted anyone going back to that area of the property. This warning only heightened McCormick's suspicions about the true nature of his employment. The situation became even more threatening on August 8, 1989, when Ray expressed dissatisfaction with McCormick's cattle buying abilities. The next morning, Faye made excuses about leaving early for her part-time job, the Holiday Inn, and Ray lured McCormick into the barn under the pretense of helping locate a raccoon. What McCormick discovered there saved his life and would ultimately bring down the Copelands. Ray was armed with a rifle, and McCormick noticed that a tractor had been positioned near the barn with a trailer attached, complete with a shovel and plastic sheeting. While poking a stick into a hole in the barn floor, McCormick turned to see Ray pointing the rifle directly at him. Through quick thinking and persuasion, McCormick managed to convince Ray to take him to Brookfield instead of carrying out what was clearly intended to be his death. At the courthouse in Chillicothe, they found Faye waiting, and she seemed surprised to see McCormick still alive. Later that day, the three of them went to Brookfield, where McCormick closed his checking account despite having an outstanding check for $1,157.46 to the Green City auction barn. McCormick refused to return to the farm for his belongings, effectively ending his relationship with the Copelands and saving his own life. 2 weeks later, after struggling with alcohol and the weight of what he had witnessed, McCormick found himself in Nebraska, where he called a local Crime Stoppers hotline to report that he had seen several remains on the Copeland farm. Initially, police were skeptical of McCormick's claims, but after checking Ray's extensive criminal record, they decided to investigate further. In October 1989, armed with a search warrant, dozens of officers, and a team of bloodhounds, police descended on the Copeland farm. Initially, they found no incriminating evidence on the property itself, but as they expanded their search to nearby farms where Ray had performed odd jobs, the grim truth began to emerge. The remains of 3 young men were discovered in a barn on a farm near Ludlow, Missouri. As the investigation continued, more remains were found. Wayne Warner's body was discovered buried in a shallow grave beneath thousands of large, round hay bales on another farm. Investigators also found Dennis Murphy's remains in a nearby well, weighed down with a heavy object. All of the victims had been killed with the same rifle identified in the Copeland home. The search of the Copeland farmhouse revealed a treasure trove of evidence. The guest bedroom closet was filled with clothing of different sizes, some of which was later identified as belonging to the victims. Luggage belonging to one of the victims was also found in the guest room closet. Police discovered pieces of notebook paper on which Faye had written McCormick's personal banking information. as well as the name and license number of Rose Clevenger, a woman who had accompanied McCormick to retrieve his belongings from the farm. An inventory of Faye's purse revealed signed blank checks from both McCormick and another potential victim, James Page, who had narrowly escaped the same fate. Jail personnel later discovered numerous notes that Faye had sent to Ray while they were incarcerated, suggesting her knowledge that incriminating evidence might be discovered during searches of their property. Ray Copeland, then 75 years old, and Faye, 68, were initially arrested on charges of conspiracy in connection with fraudulent cattle buying. However, as the investigation progressed and the extent of their crimes became clear, both were charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. William Webster, Missouri's Attorney General, announced that the state would seek the death penalty against both defendants. The case garnered national attention, not only because of the heinous nature of the crimes, but also because the Copelands would become the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. Faye's trial began first, in November 1990, while Ray's trial was delayed pending questions about his mental competency, as his attorneys claimed he was suffering from senility. During Faye's trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her active participation in the criminal conspiracy. Doug Roberts, the prosecutor from Livingston County, referred to the couple as 20th century cattle rustlers, who had profited $32,000 from their criminal enterprise. The prosecution argued that Faye was not merely a passive participant, but an active conspirator who kept detailed financial records and was present at many of the cattle purchases. The defense, led by attorney David Miller, attempted to portray Faye as a victim of domestic abuse who had been controlled and coerced by her domineering husband. They sought to present testimony from psychologist Marilyn Hutchinson regarding battered spouse syndrome, arguing that Faye's participation in the crimes was the result of years of physical and psychological abuse by Ray. However, the trial court limited this testimony during the guilt phase of the trial. Betty Lou Gibson, one of Ray's daughters, testified that her father had exerted complete control over the family. He dictated exactly what we were to do and when, she stated. There was no room for discussion. It was simply how it was. This testimony was intended to support the defense's theory that Faye had been an unwilling participant in the crimes, acting under duress from her abusive husband. However, the prosecution successfully argued that the evidence showed Faye to be an active and willing participant in the conspiracy. They pointed to her detailed record keeping, her presence at cattle auctions, a handwritten list of victims with X marks next to the names of the deceased, and her attempts to mislead authorities about her knowledge of the victims. When the sheriff asked if she was acquainted with Paul Cowart and 2 other missing men who fit the same profile, Faye denied knowing them, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The jury deliberated and found Faye Copeland guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder on November 10, 1990. The conviction made her the oldest woman ever convicted of serial killing in American history at that time. The same jury that convicted her then had to decide her punishment during the penalty phase of the trial. During the sentencing phase, 17 witnesses testified over several days as both sides presented their arguments. The prosecution argued that the deliberate and calculated nature of the crimes committed for financial gain warranted the ultimate punishment. They emphasized that if the death penalty was not appropriate in this case, with its clear evidence of premeditation and multiple victims, then it would be difficult to justify its use in any case. The defense continued to argue that Faye had been a victim of domestic violence and that her advanced age should be considered as a mitigating factor. They presented testimony about battered spouse syndrome and argued that Faye had lived under Ray's complete control throughout their marriage. A psychologist testified that Faye fit the profile of a battered woman, exhibiting behaviors consistent with long-term abuse. On November 13, 1990, the jury recommended that Faye Copeland be sentenced to death for 4 of the 5 murders. She received the death penalty for the murders of Paul Cowart, John Freeman, Jimmy Harvey, and Wayne Warner. while receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder of Dennis Murphy. At 69 years old, Faye Copeland became the oldest woman ever sentenced to death in Missouri since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1977. Ray Copeland's case proceeded differently due to questions about his mental competency. His defense attorneys successfully argued that he was suffering from degenerative brain disease that made him unlikely to live long enough to be executed. As a result, plea negotiations began that would have resulted in Ray pleading guilty to all counts in exchange for life sentences without the possibility of parole, with the state agreeing to waive the death penalty in Faye's case as well. However, complications arose when the prosecutor, Doug Roberts, was disqualified from Ray's case due to a conflict of interest stemming from his previous representation of Ray in a bankruptcy proceeding and Faye in civil litigation. When Assistant Attorney General Hulshoff was appointed to prosecute Ray's case, he refused to honor the plea agreement that Roberts had negotiated, arguing that it had never been formally approved by the court. Despite these legal maneuverings, Ray Copeland was eventually convicted and sentenced to death as well. The elderly couple thus became the oldest man and woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. Their case attracted significant media attention and became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television programs examining the unusual phenomenon of serial killers beginning their careers so late in life. The investigation revealed that the Copelands had employed up to 20 transient workers since 1986, with 8 individuals still missing at the time of their arrest. While only 5 murders were proven in court, investigators suspected that the true number of victims might have been higher. The systematic nature of their crimes, evidenced by Faye's record keeping and the list of names with notations, suggested a well-organized operation that had likely been ongoing for several years. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of homeless and transient populations to predatory criminals. The victims were all men who had fallen on hard times and were seeking work and shelter. Their disappearances had gone largely unnoticed by society, making them perfect targets for the Copeland scheme. This aspect of the case brought attention to the need for better protection and support systems for homeless individuals. Ray Copeland died in prison in 1993, 3 years after his conviction, never having been executed due to his failing health. Faye's death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and she died on December 30, 2003, at the age of 82, in a nursing home in Chillicothe, Missouri. She had spent the final years of her life as one of the oldest prisoners in the American correctional system. The Copeland case remains one of the most chilling examples of how ordinary-appearing individuals can harbor extraordinary capacity for wrongdoing. Their story serves as a reminder that predators can exist in any community and that the most vulnerable members of society often face the greatest risks. The 5 men who lost their lives due to the actions of Ray and Faye Copeland deserved dignity, safety, and the chance to rebuild their lives, not to become victims of a calculated scheme motivated by nothing more than greed and callousness. The brutal Christmas Day home invasion that forever changed one family. On the quiet night of December 23, 2006, 18-year-old Ryan Waller and his girlfriend, 21-year-old Heather Marie Kwan, settled in for a peaceful evening at their small rental home on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The young couple, who had been together for 8 months, was looking forward to spending the holiday season together in the comfort of their shared living space with roommate Alicia, who happened to be away that evening. Neither could have imagined that this quiet December night would become the darkest moment of their lives, forever altering the course of 2 families and exposing devastating flaws within the Phoenix Police Department's handling of violent crimes. Ryan Thomas Waller was born on February 12, 1988, in Knoxville, Tennessee, into a family that would later describe him as a talented young man with a passion for playing guitar and working with gadgets. His father, Don Waller, would later become his son's most vocal advocate in the fight for justice. spending years trying to hold the Phoenix Police Department accountable for their treatment of Ryan during the most vulnerable moments of his life. The family had moved from Tennessee to Arizona, where Ryan was trying to build a life for himself in the desert city, working and sharing a home with Heather, a bright young woman who had captured his heart. Heather Marie Kwan was a 2003 graduate of Mountain Ridge High School who had completed her education at Glendale Community College and was pursuing her studies at Arizona State University with dreams of attending law school. Born and raised in Arizona, she was known for her bright and compassionate nature, volunteering as a big sister with the Valley Big Brother Sister program and dedicating herself to helping others who needed support most. Those who knew her described her as someone who could sense when another person was hurting and would offer her friendship without hesitation. At 21, she had her whole future ahead of her, planning to become a defense attorney and make a difference in the legal system. The attack came without warning when Larry Lloyd Carver and his son, Richie Lee Carver, arrived at the couple's residence seeking revenge for what they believed was a previous altercation. Larry Carver, born on December 1, 1952, and his son Richie had driven to Ryan's home with violent intentions, armed and prepared to carry out their plan for retribution. When the doorbell rang that evening, Ryan answered cautiously, seeming to recognize the two men but hesitating to allow them entry into his home. Despite Ryan's attempts to keep the door closed, the Carvers forced their way through the entrance, and in the struggle that followed, Richie Carver shot Ryan in the head at close range, believing he had ended the young man's life. The attackers then entered the residence fully, where they encountered Heather, who had witnessed the attack on her boyfriend and now posed a threat to their escape. In a moment of cold calculation, they decided she could not be left alive to testify against them, and Heather Marie Kwan tragically lost her life due to the actions of both father and son. The Carvers ransacked the home, stealing several weapons and a computer before fleeing the scene, convinced they had eliminated both witnesses to their violent crime. For 2 full days, Ryan lay severely injured and unconscious in his home, while Heather remained on the couch, both victims left for dead in the aftermath of this senseless attack. When Ryan and Heather failed to appear for their planned Christmas celebrations, concerned family members grew worried about their absence. Ryan's father made the decision to check on his son, and what he saw through the window of the residence sent chills through him, the still form of a person on the couch inside. Rather than immediately breaking into the home, police were called and insisted on obtaining a search warrant before entering, a delay that would prove costly for Ryan, who was clinging to life inside. When the roommate Alicia returned home during this waiting period, she provided access to the house, and officers finally discovered the full horror of what had transpired. Inside, they found Heather and Ryan Waller miraculously still alive, but bearing massive trauma to his face and head. His left eye was swollen completely shut, and dried blood covered his features, creating a shocking sight that immediately led investigators to view him with suspicion. Rather than recognizing the severity of his injuries and calling for immediate medical assistance, the Phoenix Police Department made the fateful decision to treat Ryan as their primary suspect in Heather's death. They placed him in the back of a police vehicle, where he would remain for 4 agonizing hours while they processed the crime scene, his brain continuing to bleed and swell without any medical intervention. At approximately 5 a.m., Ryan was finally transporting to the police station, still wearing the white jumpsuit provided after his clothing was confiscated as evidence. Detective Paul Dalton began what would become one of the most controversial interrogations in Phoenix Police Department history, questioning a young man who had a bullet lodged in his brain and was suffering from severe head trauma. Throughout the lengthy interrogation, Ryan's speech was slurred and his responses confused, yet rather than recognizing these as signs of serious medical distress, investigators interpreted his behavior as deception or guilt. During the hours-long questioning, Ryan repeatedly tried to explain what had happened, mentioning the names Richie and Larry Carver as the perpetrators who had come to his home and subjected both him and Heather to serious harm. His account included details about being shot with revolvers, but his confused state and difficulty speaking clearly made his testimony seem unbelievable to investigators who had already formed their theory about domestic violence. When Detective Dalton informed Ryan that Heather had lost her life, genuine surprise registered in the young man's voice, suggesting he was only beginning to piece together the full scope of the tragedy. It was not until more than 6 hours after being found that Ryan was finally taken to a hospital, where medical professionals immediately recognized the severity of his condition. X-rays and scans revealed that he had indeed been shot in the face, with a bullet entering the left side of his head and causing massive brain swelling. Bone fragments had been driven into his brain tissue, and a bullet splinter was lodged behind his left eye, requiring immediate surgical intervention. The delay in receiving medical care had allowed a serious infection to develop, complicating his treatment and requiring him to spend 35 days in the hospital. The medical team was forced to remove a portion of Ryan's brain to save his life, and he lost his left eye as a direct result of the gunshot wound. During his recovery, he endured severe seizures that would plague him for the remainder of his shortened life. His father, Don Waller, later revealed that Ryan also suffered a broken jaw that the family believed was caused by police during his arrest, though this allegation was never proven in court. The young man who had once played guitar and worked with gadgets was left permanently disabled, requiring constant care and supervision due to his ongoing medical complications. While Ryan fought for his life in the hospital, investigators finally began pursuing the real perpetrators of the crime. Richie Lee Carver was arrested first, and despite initial reports suggesting a personal vendetta between him and Ryan, it became clear that the two barely knew each other. Richie had a documented history of assault and domestic violence charges, along with a 4-year prison sentence for armed robbery that painted a picture of an individual prone to violent behavior. During his trial in 2008, he was convicted of felony murder, burglary, aggravated assault, and misconduct involving weapons, receiving a sentence of natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. Larry Carver's path to justice proved far more complicated and would require years of legal battles to resolve. After the attack, he fled to California with the weapon, attempting to escape prosecution for his role in the crimes. When he eventually returned, his wife Cheryl initially provided police with information about his confession, but she later invoked spousal testimonial privilege and refused to testify against her husband in court. This legal protection for married couples created a loophole that initially allowed Larry Carver to escape justice for his participation in Heather's death and Ryan's near-fatal shooting. Heather's family refused to accept this injustice and began lobbying for legislative change that would prevent future cases from being dismissed due to spousal privilege. Their efforts resulted in the passage of Heather's Law, which amended the marital privilege statute to compel a defendant's spouse to testify if they voluntarily provided police with information about the other spouse's involvement in a serious crime. This groundbreaking legislation ensured that confessions made to spouses could not be later retracted without consequences, closing the loophole that had initially protected Larry Carver from prosecution. After a lengthy legal battle over whether the new law could be applied retroactively to Larry Carver's case, the Arizona Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the state, and he was re-indicted in November 2011. The charges against him included first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, burglary, and aggravated assault. During his 10-day trial, prosecutors presented evidence of his confession to his wife and his role in planning and executing the attack on Ryan and Heather. After deliberating for 2.5 days, the jury reached a verdict of guilty on all counts, and Larry Lloyd Carver was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery described the verdict as a long-awaited milestone on what has been a tortuous and difficult road to justice for the victims of this terrible crime, requiring an extraordinary detour through our state legislature. Judge Susanna Pinder imposed the sentence on January 25, 2013, ensuring that both father and son would spend the rest of their lives behind bars for their roles in this senseless tragedy. Larry Carver would later pass away while serving his sentence, but not before justice had finally been served for the victims and their families. Throughout the criminal proceedings, disturbing questions emerged about the timeline of the attack and the Phoenix Police Department's handling of the investigation. Ryan's family and roommates testified that the attack occurred on Christmas night, December 25, 2006, contradicting the police department's official timeline that placed it on December 23rd. Even Heather's obituary and headstone list her date of death as December 25, 2006, supporting the family's account of when the tragedy actually occurred. This discrepancy raised suspicions that the police might have deliberately altered the timeline to minimize scrutiny of their failure to provide timely medical care to Ryan. The Waller family's pursuit of justice extended beyond the criminal prosecution of the attackers to include accountability for the Phoenix Police Department's mishandling of their son's case. In their view, the 6-hour delay in providing medical attention to Ryan, during which time he was treated as a suspect rather than a victim, constituted gross negligence that significantly worsened his injuries and long-term prognosis. Don Waller spent 4 years preparing a $15 million lawsuit against the city of Phoenix and the Phoenix Police Department, seeking justice for his son's mistreatment during the most critical hours after the attack. The family's case was built on the testimony of medical experts who were prepared to explain how the delay in treatment allowed Ryan's brain to continue bleeding and swelling, causing catastrophic and potentially preventable damage. Don Waller paid a brain surgeon a $110,000 retainer fee to serve as an expert witness who would testify that every minute of delay in treating a bleeding brain can result in permanent disability or death. The family's legal team was confident they could prove that the Phoenix Police Department's negligence directly contributed to the severity of Ryan's lifelong disabilities and shortened lifespan. However, just 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, the city of Phoenix filed a motion for dismissal, presenting their own expert who claimed that the delay in medical treatment would not have altered the outcome of Ryan's injuries. This expert's assessment suggested that Ryan would have suffered the same level of brain damage whether he received immediate medical attention or waited 6 hours for treatment, a conclusion that Don Waller vehemently disputed based on basic medical knowledge about brain injuries. Despite the family's preparation and the strength of their evidence, the court ruled in favor of the defense's expert opinion, and the lawsuit was dismissed without ever reaching trial. The dismissal left the Waller family devastated, and without legal recourse for their sons, suffering at the hands of the Phoenix Police Department. Don Waller expressed his belief that there had been clear wrongdoing by the Phoenix police and asked anyone who learned about the case to share Ryan's story so that the family might eventually have their day in court. The father's disappointment was evident as he described spending years preparing for a trial that was dismissed just weeks before it could begin, denying the family the opportunity to present their case to a judge and jury. Following his release from the hospital, Ryan moved back in with his parents as his ongoing health complications made independent living impossible. The seizures that began during his hospital stay continued to plague him, causing regular injuries and requiring constant supervision to ensure his safety. His family watched helplessly as the vibrant young man who had once filled their home with music and laughter struggled with the devastating aftermath of his injuries. The bullet fragments and bone splinters that remained in his brain served as permanent reminders of that terrible December night when his life changed forever. On January 20, 2016, nearly 10 years after the attack that changed his life, Ryan Thomas Waller passed away from the complications of his injuries. Don Waller shared the heartbreaking news that his son had suffered his last seizure and passed peacefully, surrounded by the family who had fought tirelessly for his care and justice. Ryan was just 28 years old when he left this world, having spent more than a third of his life dealing with the consequences of a violent crime and a failed police investigation. His passing marked the end of a tragic story that had captured national attention and exposed serious flaws in how law enforcement handles victims of violent crimes. The legacy of Ryan Waller and Heather Kwan extends far beyond their individual tragedies, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of proper police procedures and the devastating consequences when those procedures fail. Heather's law continues to ensure that future criminal cases cannot be dismissed simply because a spouse refuses to testify after voluntarily providing incriminating information to police. Ryan's story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of investigative tunnel vision and the critical importance of treating all individuals at crime scenes as potential victims rather than immediate suspects. The pain endured by both the Waller and Kwan families serves as a lasting testament to the need for justice, compassion, and accountability in our legal system, ensuring that no other families will have to endure such preventable suffering in their pursuit of truth and healing. The vanishing of 5 children on Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, a fire would destroy more than just a family's home. It would create one of America's most haunting mysteries, leaving behind questions that would torment a family for generations. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a life of success and respect in their new country, would watch helplessly as flames consumed their house, and they believed 5 of their beloved children. The Sodder family story began across an ocean in Italy. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddo in Tula, Sardinia, in 1895, a young man who carried secrets about his homeland that he would never fully share. At just 13 years old, he made the brave journey to America in 1908, accompanied by an older brother who immediately returned to Italy upon clearing customs at Ellis Island. George would never speak much about why he had left his homeland, but he was determined to build something meaningful in his new country. Starting with menial work carrying water and supplies to railroad workers in Pennsylvania, George gradually built his American dream. He moved to West Virginia, first working as a driver in Smithers, then launching his own trucking company. His business began by hauling filled dirt to construction sites and later expanded to hauling the coal that powered the region. It was in Smithers that George walked into a local store called the Music Box and met Jenny Cipriani, the daughter of a storekeeper who had also emigrated from Italy as a child. They married in 1922 and settled in Fayetteville, a town with a substantial Italian immigrant community where they felt at home. Over the next 20 years, George and Jenny built both a thriving business and a large, loving family. They had 10 children between 1923 and 1943, raising them in a 2-story timber frame house 2 miles north of town. The family became, in the words of one local official, one of the most respected middle-class families around. George's trucking business prospered, and the Sodders were known throughout the community as hard-working, devoted parents who cherished each of their children. However, George's success came with a price. He held strong opinions about many subjects and was never shy about expressing them. Most significantly, his vocal opposition to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had led to heated arguments with other members of the immigrant community. These political disagreements would later take on a sinister significance when tragedy struck the family. By 1945, the Sodder children ranged from 23-year-old John down to 2-year-old Sylvia. Their second oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military during World War II. The family had settled into comfortable routines, with George's business providing well for their needs and Jenny managing their bustling household with love and efficiency. In the months leading up to Christmas 1945, however, several disturbing incidents had occurred that would later seem like warnings of the disaster to come. In October, a life insurance salesman visited their home, becoming increasingly aggressive when George declined his services. The man's parting words were chilling. "Your house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be lost. You are going to be paid for the remarks you have been making about Mussolini." Around the same time, another visitor to the house, ostensibly seeking work, had wandered to the back of the property and warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George found this observation puzzling, since he had recently had the house rewired when an electric stove was installed, and the local electric company had pronounced the wiring safe. Even more unsettling, George's older sons had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town in the weeks before Christmas, its occupants watching intently as the younger Sodder children returned from school. These incidents, dismissed at the time as the ramblings of eccentric visitors and overly suspicious minds, would take on a much darker meaning in the aftermath of what was to come. Christmas Eve 1945 began as a joyous celebration for the Sodder family. Marion, the 19-year-old daughter who worked at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville, had surprised 3 of her younger sisters with new toys she had bought as gifts. 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty were so excited by their presents that they asked their mother if they could stay up past their usual bedtime. At 10 p.m. Their mother agreed, asking only that 14-year-old Morris and 9-year-old Louis remember to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed. George and the 2 oldest boys still at home, 22-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., had already gone to sleep after a day of working with their father in the trucking business. Jenny took 2-year-old Sylvia upstairs with her, and they went to bed together, leaving the 5 middle children to enjoy their extended evening. At 12:30 a.m., the telephone's shrill ring pierced the quiet house. Jenny woke and went downstairs to answer it, finding an unfamiliar woman's voice asking for a name she didn't recognize. In the background, she could hear laughter and the clinking of glasses, as if a party was in progress. Jenny told the caller she had reached the wrong number, later recalling the woman's weird laugh. As she hung up and prepared to return to bed, she noticed that the lights were still on throughout the house, and the curtains remained open. 2 tasks the children normally attended to when they stayed up later than their parents. Looking around, Jenny saw Marion asleep on the living room couch and assumed the other children who had stayed up late had gone back to their attic bedrooms. She turned out the lights, closed the curtains, and returned upstairs. At 1 a.m., she was awakened again by a loud bang on the house's roof, followed by a rolling noise. After listening for a moment and hearing nothing more, she drifted back to sleep. 30 minutes later, Jenny awoke to the smell of smoke. When she investigated, she discovered that George's office was on fire around the telephone line and fuse box. She immediately woke her husband, and together they roused their older sons. The family's escape was swift but heartbreaking. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., managed to flee the burning house. They frantically called to the children upstairs, but heard no response. The stairway itself was already engulfed in flames, making it impossible to reach the attic where 5 children supposedly slept. George's desperate attempts to save his missing children would be thwarted at every turn. Barefoot and frantic, he tried to climb the house's outside wall, breaking a window and badly cutting his arm in the process. He and his sons planned to use a ladder to reach the attic, but the ladder that was always kept against the house was mysteriously missing. In desperation, George tried to drive one of his 2 coal trucks up to the house to use it as a platform to reach the upstairs windows. Although both trucks had worked perfectly the day before, neither would start. Even a water barrel that could have been used to fight the fire was frozen solid. The family's attempts to summon help were equally frustrated. The phone lines were dead, so Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. She could not reach an operator. A passing driver who saw the flames also tried to call from a nearby tavern, but he too was unsuccessful in reaching emergency services. Eventually, either the neighbor or the passing motorist managed to reach the fire department from another phone in the center of town. The Fayetteville Fire Department operating with a phone tree system during the war years when manpower was limited, did not arrive until 8 a.m. By that time, the Sodders' home had been reduced to nothing more than a smoking pile of ash. Chief F.J. Morris would later explain that the already slow response was further delayed because he could not drive the fire truck himself and had to wait for someone qualified to arrive. For the Sodder family, watching their house burn for over 7 hours, it felt like an eternity. When the firefighters finally arrived and conducted their search through the basement ruins, they made a discovery that would haunt the family forever. By 10 a.m., Chief Morris told the Sodders that they had found no bones, no human remains, nothing that would indicate the 5 missing children had perished in the fire. Morris suggested that the fire had been hot enough to completely reduce everything, but this explanation would soon prove deeply troubling to the family. The official investigation was swift and, in the family's view, inadequate. Morris instructed George to leave the site undisturbed so that the State Fire Marshal's office could conduct a thorough investigation. However, after 4 days of looking at the devastating scene, George and Jenny could not bear the sight any longer. George bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site, intending to convert it into a memorial garden for the lost children. The local coroner convened an inquest, which concluded that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. Among the jurors sat the very man who had threatened George months earlier, warning that his house would be burned down and his children harmed in retaliation for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were issued on December 30, just 6 days after the fire. The local newspaper contradicted itself in its reporting, first stating that all the bodies had been found, then later in the same story reporting that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jenny, overwhelmed by grief, could not bring themselves to attend the funeral on January 2, 1946, though their surviving children did. As the Sodder family began the agonizing process of rebuilding their lives, they started to question every aspect of the official findings. Their doubts were reinforced by several disturbing discoveries. If the fire had been caused by an electrical problem, as stated in the official report, why had the family's Christmas lights remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have gone out? A few months later, they found the missing ladder at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away from the house, suggesting it had been deliberately moved. A telephone repairman informed the Sodders that their phone line had not been burned through in the fire, but had been cut by someone willing and able to climb 14 feet up the pole and reach 2 feet away from it to sever the line. A man whom neighbors had seen stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire was arrested and admitted to the theft. He claimed he had cut what he thought was a power line while committing the robbery, but this explanation raised more questions than it answered. Jenny struggled to accept Chief Morris's claim that all traces of the children's bodies had been completely consumed by the fire. She had seen household appliances and fragments of the tin roof still recognizable in the ashes. She conducted her own experiments, burning small piles of animal bones to see if they would be completely consumed, but none ever were. An employee at a local crematorium told her that human bones remain even after being burned at extremely high temperatures for hours, far longer and hotter than their house fire could have been. In early 1946, new evidence emerged that seemed to support the family's growing belief that the fire had been deliberately set. A bus driver who had passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve reported seeing people throwing objects that looked like fireballs at the Sodder house. When the snow melted, young Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green, rubber ball-like object in the brush near their former home. George, remembering his wife's account of the loud thump on the roof before the fire, believed it looked like some kind of incendiary device used in warfare. Most compelling of all were the reported sightings of the missing children. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road claimed she had seen some of the children peering out of a passing car while the house was still burning. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said she had served the children breakfast the next morning, noting the presence of a car with Florida license plates. A woman at a Charleston hotel later came forward after seeing the children's photos in a newspaper, stating she had seen 4 of the 5 children a week after the fire. According to her statement to authorities, the children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared unfriendly and refused to allow me to talk to these children. Desperate for answers, the Sodders hired private investigator C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Gawley Bridge. Tinsley made several disturbing discoveries about the official investigation. He learned that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was not only on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident, but had also increased the family's home insurance from $1,500 to $1,750 before the fire, without their knowledge or consent. More shocking still, Tinsley uncovered rumors that despite Chief Morris's public statements, he had actually found human remains in the ashes. According to these rumors, Morris had discovered something he thought was a human organ, which he packed into a metal box and secretly buried at the site. A local minister supposedly confirmed this story to George. When George and Tinsley confronted Morris with this information, he agreed to show them where he had buried the box. They dug it up and took the contents to a local funeral director for examination. The funeral director concluded that the supposed human organ was actually beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Later rumors suggested that Morris had planted the liver in hopes that finding anything would satisfy the Sodders and end their investigation. In 1947, George and Jenny wrote to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover pleading for federal intervention. Hoover's response was disappointing. Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. He added that FBI agents would assist if local authorities requested their help, but the Fayetteville Police and Fire Departments declined the offer. In August 1949, George managed to convince Oscar Hunter, a pathologist from Washington, D.C., to supervise a new, thorough search of the house site. This excavation uncovered several small objects, including a damaged dictionary that had belonged to the children, some coins, and several small bone fragments. The bone fragments were sent to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution, for analysis. Newman's report provided both hope and confusion for the family. The bones were confirmed to be human vertebrae, all from the same person. However, the age analysis was troubling. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. Given this age range, it was unlikely that these bones belonged to any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Morris, had been only 14. More significantly, Newman reported that the bones showed no sign of exposure to flame. He agreed that it was very strange that only these vertebrae were found, since a wood fire of such short duration should have left complete skeletons of all the children. The report concluded that the vertebrae had most likely come from the dirt George had used to fill the basement. Later investigation suggested the bone fragments had come from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, though no one could explain how they had arrived at the fire site. The Smithsonian's findings prompted hearings at the West Virginia State Capitol in Charleston. After reviewing the evidence, Governor Oki L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders their case was hopeless and officially closed it at the state level. The FBI also dropped their investigation after 2 years of following fruitless leads. Undaunted by official indifference, the Sodder family refused to give up hope. In 1952, they erected a billboard at the site of their former home, displaying photographs of the 5 missing children and offering a $5,000 reward for information that would resolve even one case. The reward was soon doubled to $10,000. The billboard became a landmark for travelers on what is now State Route 16, a constant reminder of the family's unending search for truth. The family's efforts brought forth additional reported sightings over the years. Tips came from across the country. A woman in St. Louis claimed Martha was being held in a convent. A bar patron in Texas reported overhearing incriminating statements about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia, and a relative in Florida was investigated when their children resembled the missing Sodder children. George personally traveled to investigate many of these leads, always returning home without answers, but never losing hope. In the late 1960s, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny received an envelope postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a man in his mid-20s who bore a striking resemblance to what Louis might have looked like as an adult. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie Illil Boys, A90-132 or 35. The family hired another private detective to investigate this lead, but he never reported back, and they were unable to locate him afterward. George Sodder passed away in 1969, still searching for answers about his missing children. Jenny continued the investigation with her surviving children, wearing black every day until her death in 1989 as a sign of perpetual mourning. She erected a fence around their property and added rooms to their home, creating layers between herself and the outside world. When Jenny died, the weathered billboard that had stood for nearly 4 decades was finally taken down. The surviving Sodder children and their descendants continue to seek answers well into the 21st century. They theorized that the local mafia had tried to recruit or extort George, and when he refused, they kidnapped his children as punishment. Some believed the children might have been taken back to Italy or hidden elsewhere in the United States. If the children had survived and lived for decades, the family believed they might have avoided contact to protect their parents and remaining siblings from further harm. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest survivor who had been only 2 years old on the night of the fire, died in 2021 at age 79. Until the end, she remained convinced that her siblings had escaped the flames. Her daughter, Jenny Henthorne, told The Independent that Sylvia promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything she could to find the truth. The Sodder children case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Whether Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty perished in the flames that Christmas Eve or somehow escaped to live new lives elsewhere, their story represents the profound love and determination of parents who refused to accept an official explanation that felt incomplete and inadequate. The case serves as a reminder of how tragedy can transform a family's entire existence, leaving behind questions that echo through generations, and the enduring power of hope, even in the face of the most heartbreaking uncertainty. For the Sodder family, the search for truth became a sacred mission that defined their lives, honoring the memory of 5 beloved children whose fate remains forever unknown. The final moment of a young life lost. Carly Jane Brusher was born on March 16, 1992, to Joseph Brusher and Susan Scorpin in Nassau County, New York. When Carly was just 1 year old, her parents' marriage began to unravel, leading to a divorce in 1993. The separation tore the family apart, with Susan taking Carly to start a new life in Sarasota, Florida, while Joseph remained in Belmore, Long Island. Despite the distance, Carly maintained a loving relationship with her father, visiting him during Christmas and summer breaks, where they would go to amusement parks and embark on shoe shopping trips that she cherished. In Florida, Susan eventually married Steve Kanzler, giving Carly a stepfather who cared deeply for her. Carly thrived in her blended family, becoming known as a bubbly, thoughtful girl who earned straight A's in school. Her teachers described her as an excellent student who once organized a goodbye card for her teacher, getting all her classmates to sign it. At home, Carly had a special way of making her mother laugh by singing off-key, and she developed a fondness for collecting shoes. Bob Hageman, her principal at Macintosh Middle School, remembered her as a shining light who brought joy to everyone around her. By February 2004, 11-year-old Carly was in 6th grade and living what seemed like a normal childhood in Sarasota. On Sunday, February 1st, she spent the afternoon at her friend's house, planning to return home to watch the Super Bowl with her family. It was around 6:15 p.m. when she began the familiar 1-mile walk home along Bee Ridge Road. Her friend's mother, Connie Arnold, had called Susan to make sure it was okay for Carly to walk home alone, but Susan expressed concern about her daughter walking along the busy road. Steve Kanzler immediately left to pick her up, but by the time he arrived at the friend's house, Carly had already begun her journey home. He missed her by just a couple of minutes at most, a timing that would haunt him forever. When Carly failed to arrive home by her expected time, Susan immediately knew something was wrong. "In my heart, in my mind, I knew," she later told investigators. Within just 30 minutes of Carly's disappearance, her worried parents contacted the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. What they didn't know was that at approximately 6:20 p.m., security cameras at Elvie's Car Wash on Bee Ridge Road had captured the last moments of Carly's life. The grainy surveillance footage showed Carly walking through the car wash parking lot when a dark-haired man with visible tattoos approached her. The man, later identified as 37-year-old Joseph Smith, was seen speaking briefly with the young girl before taking her by the arm and leading her out of view of the cameras toward a Buick Century station wagon. The abduction happened in broad daylight with people less than 300 feet away, as Carly's father would later painfully recount. The car wash was part of a complex that included a miniature golf course and ice cream parlor, making the brazen nature of the crime all the more shocking. Joseph Smith was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. The unemployed auto mechanic and father of 3 daughters from Brooklyn had a lengthy criminal record, including multiple drug arrests. Most troubling was that Smith was currently on probation, having been released from state prison just 13 months prior to Carly's abduction. He had previously been charged with kidnapping and false imprisonment in another case, though he had been acquitted. At the time he encountered Carly, Smith was living a troubled life marked by substance abuse and criminal behavior that should have kept him behind bars. The search for Carly began immediately, with law enforcement agencies launching a massive manhunt. The surveillance video was broadcast nationwide, generating thousands of tips and leads from concerned citizens who had seen the footage. A $25,000 reward was offered for information leading to Carly's safe return. For 4 agonizing days, the community held on to hope that the bright 6th grader would be found alive. That hope was shattered on February 5, 2004, when Smith's own brother, John Smith, led investigators to a heartbreaking discovery. Smith had called his brother from jail, revealing the location where Carly's remains could be found. She was discovered behind Central Church of Christ, just a few miles from where she had been taken 4 days earlier. The 11-year-old was found with signs of mistreatment, and the medical examiner determined she had lost her life due to strangulation. The evidence against Smith quickly mounted. DNA testing revealed Smith's genetic material on Carly's shirt, while fibers from her clothing were found in the Buick Century station wagon he had been using. The FBI laboratory analysis would prove crucial in establishing the connection between Smith and the crime. Even more damaging were the recorded phone conversations Smith had with his brother John while in custody, during which he admitted involvement with Carly. The case went to trial in November 2005, with prosecutors presenting what legal experts called one of the strongest cases they had ever seen. The prosecution, led by Deborah Reaver, methodically laid out the evidence showing how Smith had used power and control to abduct, mistreat, and ultimately take the life of 11-year-old Carly. The surveillance video was shown to jurors, who watched in somber silence as the grainy footage captured Carly's final moments of freedom. Prosecutors explained how marks on Carly's wrists suggested they had been restrained, and that Smith had strangled her from behind. The defense, led by Adam Tebrog, argued that the evidence was inconclusive and that other suspects hadn't been properly investigated. They contended that once law enforcement focused on Smith, They stopped pursuing other leads, including a man who lived at the house where Carly had spent her last day. The defense also questioned the reliability of the DNA evidence, citing past cases where FBI laboratory employees had made false reports. During the penalty phase of the trial, both families faced the courtroom to share their pain. Susan Scorpin took the witness stand, fighting back tears as she described the devastating loss of her daughter. "I lost the love of my life," she testified, her voice breaking with emotion. "I cry for her at all hours of the day. I cry for her at night. I'm broken. I will never heal." Outside the courthouse, when asked about Smith's fate, Susan's grief turned to anger. "I'd like him gone today." Joseph Brusher, Carly's father, also testified about the impact of losing his daughter. "When Carly was taken from our family, it hurt us to the core," he said. "Many times, I didn't want to go on and was close to taking my own life." He recalled their special times together during her visits to Long Island, the amusement park trips and shoe shopping expeditions that now lived only in memory. Susan Van Alstyne, Carly's former teacher, described her as an exceptional student who brought joy to the classroom. She told jurors about Carly's thoughtful nature and how she had organized that goodbye card, showing her caring spirit even as a young child. The testimony painted a picture of a vibrant girl whose life had been cut tragically short, a future filled with promise that would never be realized. The defense presented 13 character witnesses on Smith's behalf, painting a different picture of the defendant. A former babysitter described him as a good father who loved his children and took care of them well. His spiritual advisor and the mother of a woman he had dated testified that Smith treated children kindly and had expressed a desire to overcome his drug addiction, though he never enrolled in treatment. These witnesses asked jurors to consider Smith's troubled background and addiction issues as mitigating factors that should spare him from execution. On November 17, 2005, after deliberating the evidence, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts: kidnapping, capital sexual battery, and first-degree murder. The conviction brought some measure of justice for Carly's family, though it could never truly heal their pain. During the penalty phase, jurors heard arguments about whether Smith should receive life in prison or face execution. Prosecutor Deborah Reaver argued that Smith's desire to avoid arrest by silencing Carly as a witness was one of 6 aggravating factors justifying the death penalty. The defendant did not have to take the life of this girl, she told the jury. The jury ultimately recommended death, and the judge sentenced Smith to die by lethal injection. Smith was sent to Florida's death row, where he would remain for the next 16 years as his case went through the lengthy appeals process. The conviction provided some closure for Carly's family, but their healing journey was far from over. The tragedy's impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Carly's story sparked national conversations about child safety and the monitoring of dangerous offenders in communities. Representative Catherine Harris introduced legislation known as Carly's Law, which aimed to toughen parole rules for offenders and notify non-custodial parents about criminal activity near their children's homes. Though Joseph Brusher supported the law being named after his daughter, he acknowledged it wouldn't have prevented her specific case. The bill ultimately failed to pass, but it represented society's attempt to honor Carly's memory through meaningful change. For Susan Scorpin, the years following Carly's loss became increasingly difficult. Unable to cope with the devastating grief, she turned to substance abuse as a way to numb the pain. Despite her efforts to immerse herself in advocating for children's rights, Susan battled addiction and was arrested several times on drug-related charges. In July 2005, she lost custody of her 7-year-old son after failing a drug test, adding another layer of heartbreak to her already shattered life. Child advocate Judy Cornett, who became close friends with Susan after Carly's passing, described her as an interesting lady, hiding behind her addiction. The void of Carly not being a part of her life became a huge scar on her heart and a big missing puzzle piece, Cornett explained. Tragically, Susan Scorpin was found deceased on April 10th of a suspected overdose at age 47, never having recovered from the loss of her beloved daughter. On July 26, 2021, Joseph Smith's story came to an end when he passed away in prison while still on death row at Union Correctional Institution. He was 55 years old and had spent over 15 years awaiting execution for his crimes. His natural death meant that the formal justice system's final chapter would never be written, leaving some feeling that true justice had been denied. The memory of Carly Jane Grusha lives on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her, and in the minds of strangers who were touched by her story. Her bright smile, her love for her family, and her promising future were stolen in a moment of unspeakable violence that shocked a community and a nation. The 11-year-old girl who loved to sing off-key to make her mother laugh, who earned straight A's, and who dreamed of ordinary childhood adventures became a symbol of innocence lost and the urgent need to protect the most vulnerable among us. The tragic loss of Katie Fusco, when love became deadly. Katie Rose Fusco was just 18 years old when she made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. Born Denise Pladdle on January 29, 1998, she had been given a chance at life when she was just 8 months old. Her birth mother, Alyssa Garcia, had made the heart-wrenching choice to place her for adoption after witnessing troubling behavior from her biological father, Stephen Pladdle. What began as a rescue would later become a tragedy that shocked the nation and left 3 innocent lives lost due to the actions of one man consumed by unthinkable desires. The story began in 1995 when 20-year-old Stephen Walter Pladdle met 15-year-old Alyssa Garcia over the internet. Stephen traveled to San Antonio, Texas, where he began a relationship with the vulnerable teenager, eventually convincing her to leave with him to New York. At just 16, Alyssa became pregnant, and their daughter was born in January 1998. But the joy of new life was quickly overshadowed by Stephen's disturbing behavior toward the infant. Alyssa would later describe how Stephen would pinch the baby hard enough to leave marks. In one alarming incident, he even placed the helpless child inside a cooler, nearly cutting off her airflow. Alyssa recalled Stephen's chilling attitude. He wanted to be rid of her. He didn't like the crying. Fearing for her daughter's safety and recognizing that Stephen posed a genuine threat to the child, Alyssa made the difficult decision to give her baby up for adoption when she was just 8 months old. It was so hard to give her up, Alyssa later said, but I had to because I wanted her to live and be happy. The baby found a loving home with Anthony and Kelly Fusco, a caring couple from Dover, New York, about 80 miles north of New York City. Anthony, affectionately known as Tony, was a former United States Coast Guard member who had risen to Chief Petty Officer during his career and was working as a correctional officer at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury. Together with Kelly, they renamed their adopted daughter Katie and gave her the stable, nurturing environment that had been denied to her in her earliest months. Katie flourished in her new home, developing into a bright and talented young woman who brought joy to everyone around her. Her uncle, Carey Good, affectionately nicknamed her Pac-Man because she was always eating, and she became known for her love of animals, even becoming a vegetarian because of her compassion for all creatures. She had a particular fondness for rescuing stray cats and spent hours caring for them. At Dover High School, Katie was recognized as an aspiring artist who was famous for creating comic strips that entertained her classmates. She was also a talented drummer and was actively involved in her school's cheerleading team. Her artistic abilities were remarkable, and she once completed an entire portfolio depicting the struggles women faced throughout American history. Katie even demonstrated leadership qualities by organizing a group of female students to petition the Dover Board of Education about what they perceived as unfair dress code policies. Katie wrote about her passion for art in her online blog, revealing the depth of her creative spirit. A pen and something to draw on became a safe place for me. Ink became my weapon against rules and regulations. To be short, for me, a life without art is no life at all. She had dreams of attending Dutchess Community College to study digital advertising, planning to combine her artistic talents with modern marketing techniques. Her adoptive parents, Tony and Kelly, were incredibly proud of the young woman she had become and supported her ambitions wholeheartedly. However, Katie had always known she was adopted, and when she turned 18 in January 2016, curiosity about her biological origins led her to search for her birth parents through social media. Her search proved successful, and she was able to locate Stephen and Alyssa Pladdle, who were still together and living in Henrico County, Virginia, with their 2 other children. The Pladdles were thrilled to be reunited with their biological daughter and welcomed the opportunity to rebuild the relationship that had been severed nearly 2 decades earlier. For Katie, meeting her birth parents represented an exciting chapter in her life, a chance to understand where she came from and to form new family bonds. Instead of starting college in August 2016, as she had planned, Katie made the momentous decision to move in with her biological parents in Virginia. Tony and Kelly Fusco were naturally apprehensive about this major change in their daughter's life, but they respected Katie's right to make her own choices as an adult and offered their full support. They believed that at 18, she was mature enough to navigate this complex family reunion and trusted that she would make good decisions for herself. What they couldn't have known was that Stephen Pladdle was not the stable father figure Katie hoped to find. The Pladdle household was already troubled when Katie arrived. Stephen and Alyssa had been experiencing significant marital problems and had decided to separate, sleeping in separate bedrooms while they worked toward divorce. Alyssa had endured years of emotional and verbal abuse from Stephen, living in constant fear of his volatile moods and explosive temper. I was always on eggshells. Whatever his mood was, everybody knew, and that mood was often not happy. A lot of yelling, a lot of things smashed in the house in front of our kids, Alyssa later explained. She had also privately told Katie about Stephen's history of mistreating her as a baby and explained that the adoption had been necessary for Katie's safety. Troublingly, Katie didn't seem concerned by this revelation about her early experiences. Shortly after Katie moved in, Stephen's behavior began to change in disturbing ways. He suddenly started dressing differently, trading his usual clothing for skinny jeans and form-fitting shirts that seemed designed to appeal to someone much younger. He shaved off his beard and began growing his hair longer, creating a completely different appearance. Most alarmingly, about 6 weeks after Katie's arrival, Stephen began sleeping on the floor in her bedroom. When Alyssa confronted him about this inappropriate behavior after it happened a second time, Stephen became defensive and angry, telling her it was none of her business before storming out of the house with Katie. This incident prompted Alyssa to finally move out of the family home in November 2016, though they continued to share custody of their 2 younger children. The truth about what was happening between Stephen and Katie remained hidden until May 2017, when Alyssa made a devastating discovery while reading one of her children's journals. Her 11-year-old daughter had written about Katie's pregnancy and revealed that Stephen was the father. The journal contained upsetting entries that showed how confused and distressed the young girl was by what she was witnessing. Katie is pregnant. Dad says they feel like couples. Did they get a little too drunk that night? My dad is messed up. He's Satan. The child had also written that Stephen had instructed both her and her sister to refer to Katie as their stepmother, despite Katie actually being their biological sister. When Alyssa confronted Stephen about these shocking revelations, his response was chilling in its casualness. I started to become hysterical, and I called him, Alyssa recalled. I said, "Is Katie pregnant with your baby?" He just said, "I thought you knew, we're in love." Alyssa's reaction was immediate and emotional. I started screaming. I was just cursing him out. "How could you? You're sick. She's a child." After this horrifying conversation, Alyssa immediately contacted the police to report the illegal relationship. Even as police began their investigation into the relationship, Stephen and Katie's actions became increasingly brazen. On July 20, 2017, just 2 months after Stephen's divorce from Alyssa was finalized, he and Katie were married in Parkton, Maryland. They falsified their marriage application, claiming they were unrelated in order to obtain the legal document. The wedding was attended by both Stephen's mother and Katie's adoptive parents, Tony and Kelly Fusco, who had reluctantly decided to support Katie despite their deep concerns about the situation. Wedding photographs showed Katie wearing a short black dress, smiling alongside Stephen, both their mothers, and her adopted father Tony. The Fuscos believed they had no choice but to support Katie, hoping that their continued presence in her life might help protect her from harm. On September 1, 2017, Katie gave birth to a baby boy named Bennett Kieron Pladdle. The couple moved to a house in Knightdale, North Carolina, where they attempted to live as a normal married couple with their infant son. Katie portrayed their life on social media as that of a happy family, posting photos that showed what appeared to be typical domestic bliss, while never acknowledging the true nature of her relationship with Stephen. To the outside world, they looked like any other young family starting their lives together. However, this facade of normalcy was shattered in January 2018 when both Stephen and Katie were arrested on charges of incest with an adult, adultery, and contributing to delinquency. The arrests came after months of investigation by authorities who had been building a case based on Alyssa's initial report. Stephen was released on bond, while Katie remained in custody until the legal proceedings could begin. A judge ordered that the couple have no contact with each other, and custody of baby Bennett was awarded to Stephen's mother. The case attracted international attention, with media outlets around the world covering the shocking story of a father and daughter who had married and had a child together. Stephen's defense attorney, Rick Friedman II, attempted to frame the case in terms that would garner sympathy for his client. He argued that there had never been any allegation that Stephen had pressured Katie into the relationship, emphasizing that she was an adult when it began. This case is an 18-year-old girl who shows up at the doorstep of a 40-year-old man who's going through difficult times with his wife, Friedman stated. They have a bond because they're biologically related, but they never knew each other before they had a relationship. He was head over heels in love with her, so much so that outweighed the issue of them being biologically related. This defense strategy sought to portray Stephen as a man overcome by genuine romantic feelings rather than someone engaging in criminal behavior. Following their arrests and the court's no-contact order, Katie moved back in with Tony and Kelly Fusco in Dover, attempting to rebuild her life away from Stephen. She established a routine of visiting her adoptive grandmother in Waterbury, Connecticut, every Tuesday and Thursday, traveling there to help clean her house and spend time together. This regular schedule provided Katie with stability and purpose as she tried to move forward from the traumatic relationship. During this period, Katie made the difficult but necessary decision to end her relationship with Stephen permanently. She called him on April 11, 2018, and informed him over the phone that she no longer wanted to continue their marriage or any form of relationship. Stephen's reaction to Katie's decision was swift and deadly. On the night of April 11, 2018, he went to his mother's home where 7-month-old Bennett was staying and took the infant, telling his mother that he planned to have a video call with Katie. What actually happened was tragic. Stephen ended Bennett's life, then hid him away in the house. He called his mother at midnight to tell her he was taking Bennett to New York, then called again at 7:00 a.m. claiming they were almost there. But the final call came at 8:45 a.m. when Stephen confessed to his mother that he had taken the lives of Katie, Anthony, and little Bennett. On the morning of April 12, 2018, Katie and Tony Fusco left their Dover home for their regular Thursday visit to Katie's grandmother in Waterbury. Unknown to them, Stephen had been watching their residence and had followed them as they began their journey. Surveillance footage later showed Stephen waiting in his minivan near the Wingdell Beer and Liquor store, just outside the mobile home park where Katie lived with her adoptive parents. He stalked them along their familiar route, knowing exactly where they were going and when they would be most vulnerable. When Katie and Tony's vehicle stopped at the intersection of Route 7 and Route 55 in New Milford, Connecticut, Stephen pulled alongside their car and opened fire with a rifle. The attack was swift, with both Katie and Tony losing their lives instantly. A nearby resident, Jeff Winesevil, heard the gunshots while tending to his horses and immediately contacted emergency services. When police arrived at the scene, they found the tragic aftermath of Stephen's calculated attack on two innocent people, whose only crime had been trying to help Katie escape from his control. After carrying out these acts, Stephen called his mother to confess what he had done. In a frantic 911 call that would later be released to the public, Stephen's mother told the dispatcher, "My son just called and told me he killed his baby." She explained that Stephen had also admitted to taking the lives of Katie and Anthony. His wife broke up with him yesterday over the phone. She's in New York, and he told me he was on his way. He killed his wife. He killed her father. I can't even believe this is happening. Stephen had also told his mother during this final conversation that he was next, indicating his intention to take his own life. Police immediately issued an alert for Stephen's light blue minivan with North Carolina license plates. Approximately 16 miles from the shooting scene in New Milford, officers from multiple agencies located the vehicle parked on the shoulder of the road in Dover, New York, with its engine still running. When they surrounded the van and looked inside, they discovered that Stephen had ended his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Meanwhile, back in North Carolina, police conducted a welfare check at Stephen's residence and made the heartbreaking discovery of baby Bennett's remains, confirming the tragic end of 3 innocent lives. In the aftermath of this tragedy, questions arose about the judicial system's handling of Stephen's case and whether more could have been done to prevent these deaths. Henrico Commonwealth's attorney Shannon Taylor defended the decision to release Stephen on bond, explaining that a pretrial assessment had revealed no red flags in his background that would have justified holding him pending trial. Stephen had no prior criminal record, and Taylor noted that certainly there was no indication from the investigation that there was any type of violence within that relationship. However, critics argued that the severity of the incest charges and the presence of a vulnerable infant should have warranted closer supervision. Stephen's defense attorney, Rick Friedman II, expressed shock at his client's actions, stating that nobody ever could have predicted what Stephen would do. Friedman maintained that during their meetings, Stephen had shown no indication of potentially turning to violence. He defended both his representation of Stephen and the court's decision to grant bond, arguing that if any judge or any prosecutor or defense attorney involved in any of these cases believed that the Pladdle child would be in harm's way, there would not have been any bond. Despite these justifications, the tragic outcome highlighted the difficulty of predicting violent behavior and protecting victims in complex family situations. The 3 victims were laid to rest together in upstate New York, with Katie, baby Bennett, and Anthony Fusco buried side by side. The community of Dover was devastated by the loss of Tony Fusco, who was remembered as a dedicated public servant and loving father. Katie's grandmother, whom she had been on her way to visit when her life was cut short, was left heartbroken by the senseless violence that had claimed her beloved granddaughter. For Alyssa Pladdle, the tragedy represented the ultimate confirmation of her worst fears about Stephen's capacity for harm. "I'm grieving, I'm sad, I'm upset," she said, "but I also want to have something good come out of this. If it's to get truth out there, to open people's eyes to incest." The loss of Katie Rose Fusco, Anthony Fusco, and baby Bennett Pladdle represents one of the most heartbreaking cases of family violence in recent memory, where an innocent young woman's desire to connect with her biological father led to unimaginable tragedy. Katie's brief life was marked by artistic talent, compassion for others, and the love of her adoptive family, who gave her every opportunity to thrive, only to see her lose her life due to the actions of someone who should have protected her above all else. Her memory, along with that of Tony Fusco and little Bennett, serves as a tragic reminder of how manipulation and control can escalate to deadly violence, leaving families forever shattered by preventable loss. The Shaughnessy family betrayal. It was March 2nd, 2018, and the home of Ted and Corey Shaughnessy in Austin, Texas, should have been a safe haven. Ted, a successful 55-year-old jeweler, and his wife Corey had built a life of comfort and prosperity through their business, Gallery Jewelers. They lived in a sprawling suburban home worth millions, surrounded by luxury and the fruits of their hard work. But just after 4 a.m. that morning, their world would be shattered in the most unimaginable way. What began as the sound of barking dogs would end with Ted losing his life due to the actions of two intruders, and Corey barely escaping the same fate. Ted and Corey had met in the early 1980s at a video arcade in Phoenix, discovering they shared a love of jewelry and eventually of each other. They married and opened their jewelry business together, creating what seemed like the perfect life. In 2000, they decided to expand their family by adopting a 16-month-old boy named Nicholas from an orphanage in Ukraine. It was just instant love, Corey would later recall, describing how they bonded over animal crackers during their first meeting. By the time we left, we were a family. Ted had a special talent for helping people express their love through jewelry, and everyone who knew him said he was beloved in the community with no enemies. Nicholas grew up with everything a child could want. His father drove race cars for fun and often took him to the track, where Nicholas loved putting on Ted's helmet and racing gloves. The family seemed genuinely happy, living comfortably off their successful jewelry business and enjoying their close relationship. In high school, Nicholas found love with a girl named Jackie Edison, who had moved from New Jersey to Austin after her parents divorced. When Nicholas brought her home to meet his parents in 2016, Corey described it as an awkward dinner, but Jackie eventually won them over. She spent so much time at the Shaughnessy home that Ted and Corey actually let her move in with them. In August 2017, Nicholas and Jackie moved out to start their new life in College Station, Texas. She enrolled in school while he tried his hand at day trading with his parents' financial backing. Ted and Corey were looking forward to their empty nest years, but they would have less than a year to enjoy this new chapter of their lives. What they didn't know was that their son was struggling financially, with a failing day trading business and mounting debts, including at least $30,000 he owed to his own mother. That fateful morning in March, Corey woke to the sound of one of their two pet Rottweilers barking. Ted sits up in bed, and he grabbed his gun to go see what it was, she later told investigators. I hadn't even gotten my head back on the pillow before I heard the first gunshot, and then there was a barrage of gunfire. Two intruders had entered through a ground floor window that had been left wide open, with the screen carefully removed and set aside. Ted never had a chance to fire his weapon before he was struck multiple times and fatally wounded. Corey found herself under attack as well. Still in bed when the shooting turned in her direction, she grabbed a .357 revolver from above her headboard and returned fire at the attackers. I ran out of ammo. I just bylaid into the closet, she said. Trapped in that closet with bullets flying around her home, she called 911 in desperation. Travis County 911, you need police, fire, or paramedic? The dispatcher asked. I don't know, I'm in the closet. There were shots fired. Help me. Corey sobbed into the phone. Even in her hiding place, she couldn't escape the horror unfolding in her home. I heard this horrible, horrible moaning, she recalled. When I came out of the closet, I saw Ted's legs and I could tell he was gone. When police arrived at the scene minutes later, it looked like a battlefield. Broken glass and bullet casings were scattered across the floor, bullets were lodged in the walls, and Ted lay near the kitchen table. One of their Rottweilers, Bart, had also lost his life to the attackers. The evidence showed this had been an intense firefight, with investigators finding both .40 caliber and .380 caliber casings, indicating two different shooters had been involved. Sitting in the back of a police cruiser that morning, Corey made the heartbreaking phone call to Nicholas, who lived with Jackie in College Station, more than 100 miles away. Detective Paul Sarlo and Detective James Moore initially thought they were dealing with a jewelry store robbery gone wrong. Ted and Corey's business made them natural targets for criminals who might assume they kept valuables at home. But as they began investigating, several details didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing had been stolen from the house or the safe, and the attackers seemed to know their way around the large, dark home. Assistant District Attorney Amy Meredith arrived at the scene around 11 a.m. and quickly became convinced this was not a stranger attack. "This was not a stranger killing," she said. "There was nothing stolen." Nicholas and Jackie arrived at the scene around 8 a.m., having made the 2-hour drive from College Station. Nicholas appeared emotional and asked Detective Sarlo what had happened. But something about his first question struck the detective as odd. "He asked me, did he suffer?" Sarlo recalled. "It definitely struck me as odd." As the morning progressed, Nicholas seemed more interested in talking to the media reporters who had gathered than in speaking with police. Even more suspicious, he walked directly to examine the ground floor window that had been the entry point, information he shouldn't have known. When investigators told Nicholas and Jackie they wanted to test their hands for gunshot residue, Jackie broke down sobbing hysterically. "That was a major red flag for me," Detective Moore said. "We knew there was something more to this at that point." Both Nicholas and Jackie insisted they had been at home in College Station when the attack occurred, and they agreed to let police search their phones and their apartment. What investigators found during that search would change everything. At the College Station apartment, police discovered ammunition that was the same brand and caliber found at the crime scene. More shocking, they found a marriage certificate showing that Nicholas and Jackie had been secretly married 8 months earlier by a high school friend named Spencer Patterson, who had been ordained online. Neither Ted nor Corey had known about the marriage, and Nicholas and Jackie hadn't mentioned it to police during their initial interviews. In all of the conversation you were having, they never said that they were married. Investigators asked Detective Moore. "No," he replied. The investigation took a darker turn when police examined Nicholas's phone and discovered he had access to his parents' home alarm system through an app. The alarm had been switched off the night of the attack, but the account history showed a window activation at 4:27 a.m., the exact time the attack began. Following that entry were glass break activations, which investigators believed occurred when bullets started breaking windows inside the house. "That's when Ted passed away. That's when the shots were being fired," Amy Meredith explained. Text messages found on Nicholas and Jackie's phones painted an even more sinister picture. Just days before the attack, Jackie had texted Nicholas asking, "Do they want $50K or not? And we can't afford to pay half before." In another exchange, Nicholas asked Jackie to withdraw money from her account, writing, "So if it happens, cash in hand." Bank records showed Jackie had withdrawn $1,000 just days before Ted's passing. Phone records also revealed that Nicholas had lied about not being in Austin for a month. His cell phone showed usage in the city on February 28th, just 2 days before the attack. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to review security video from Nicholas and Jackie's front porch, recorded 2 days before the attack. Detective Moore spotted 2 men visiting their home, and one was wearing a distinctive green Anderson Window Company t-shirt. Through an incredible stroke of luck, they tracked the shirt to an employee at the window company, whose daughter recognized the man as Johnny Leon, someone who had worked there briefly 4 years earlier. When police went to question a man named Cameron Vosmek, who appeared in the video, his wife immediately said, "I know why you're here. That kid who hired somebody to hurt his jewelry store parents." She explained that Johnny Leon had approached her husband about committing a crime for money, but he had refused. Johnny Leon was brought in for questioning and admitted that Nicholas had tried to hire him, saying, "I'm not gonna lie to you. When someone offers you $100K, you're gonna think about it." Phone records showed intensive communications between Leon and a Fort Worth man named Arian Smith around the time of the attack. When police interviewed Smith, he broke down and confessed to firing the fatal shot that ended Ted's life. "I don't understand how you could take someone's life and not have any emotion about it," Smith said through tears. I'm devastated. I cannot sleep at night. He even made the stunning request for authorities to seek the maximum penalty against him. Meanwhile, Corey had been living with Nicholas and Jackie for 3 months after the attack, completely unaware they were the ones who had orchestrated it. She had even been helping them plan a proper wedding, buying groceries, paying bills, and purchasing clothing for Jackie. Very chilling, she would later say about the realization. They thought they had gotten away with it. It wasn't until May 29, 2018, when police arrested Nicholas and Jackie for criminal solicitation, that Corey began to understand the truth. Reading the arrest affidavits, her belief in her son's innocence finally began to crumble. The investigation revealed that Nicholas had been expecting to inherit $8 million from his parents' deaths, $2 million from life insurance, and $6 million from selling the jewelry business. He had even sent chilling text messages to his friend Spencer Patterson, writing, "Just walk in and hurt a family. Steal all their stuff. No mask needed because they'll all be gone." Jackie had allegedly been making plans for spending the money, even picking out a car she wanted to buy for her mother with the inheritance. Just 2 weeks after her arrest, Jackie began cooperating with investigators, pointing the finger at Nicholas and claiming she didn't know who he had hired to carry out the attack. Her cooperation led to a reduced bond, while Nicholas remained in jail. The evidence showed that Smith had used Ted's own .40 caliber pistol, the weapon missing from the gun box found in Nicholas's old bedroom, to end his life. For Corey, learning that her husband had been killed with his own gun felt like the final, devastating confirmation of her son's betrayal. By 2021, there was a new district attorney in Travis County, Jose Garza, whose office offered plea deals to avoid lengthy trials and potential penalties. Nicholas Shaughnessy, Johnny Leon, and Arian Smith each accepted deals to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for 35-year sentences with the possibility of parole. The deals meant Nicholas could potentially be released when he turns 36. In a prison interview with 48 Hours in 2023, Nicholas admitted his guilt, saying, "Yes, Jackie and I participated in multiple aspects to end my parents' lives." When asked if he was sorry for what he did or sorry he got caught, he replied, "I'm most truly, passionately sorry for what I did." Jackie Edison received a dramatically different deal. She pleaded guilty to attempted solicitation and was sentenced to just 120 days in jail plus 10 years probation. The disparity in sentencing outraged Corey, who called it an outright dismissal of everything that I went through as a victim, and it's a dismissal of Ted's life. When 48 Hours producer Jenna Jackson approached Jackie after her release in October 2023, Jackie defended her sentence, saying, "I think that it's fair. I think it accurately reflects the level of involvement." She denied being a partner in the plot, claiming Nicholas was saying whatever he has to say to kind of clear his name. During Johnny Leon's sentencing hearing in 2021, a victim witness counselor read Corey's impact statement aloud in court. "Not me, my husband, anyone in our family, or any of our friends could have ever imagined that Nicholas and Jackie would want to have us harmed," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. She described how the attack had destroyed not just Ted's life, but everything she had built and cared about. The statement reflected the deep pain of a mother who had to confront the unthinkable truth that her own child had orchestrated the attack. At Jackie's plea hearing in 2023, Corey refused to appear in person, instead recording a video statement to be played in court. "I'm alive because your plan to have me harmed didn't succeed," she said, looking directly into the camera. "You are a monster. You are evil, and everyone needs to know it. You knew what was about to happen, and yet you sat home and did nothing because you wanted it to happen." The video captured the raw emotion of a woman who had survived an attempt on her life orchestrated by people she had trusted and welcomed into her home. Nicholas told investigators that he had been deeply influenced by Jackie, describing their relationship as very toxic and saying he had been seeking validation or approval from Jackie. He claimed that while he knew what he was doing was wrong, it was always in the back of my head, like red flags, like "stop, Don't go. He wasn't prepared to wait to inherit his parents' money naturally. Despite his claims of remorse, Corey remains unmoved. When shown his prison interview, she said, "It means nothing to me. I don't know that person. I have no idea who Nicholas Shaughnessy is." The case revealed the devastating consequences of greed and betrayal within a family that had seemed to have everything. Detective Moore and Detective Sarlo, who worked tirelessly to solve the case, expressed understanding for Corey's frustration with the disparate sentences. "She could have stopped this at any time," Moore said of Jackie. "She's no princess in this." The district attorney's office, when asked about the sentencing disparity, provided only a brief statement saying they take acts of violence seriously, and noting that Jackie faces 20 years in prison if she violates her probation terms. Today, Corey lives out of state under a different name, trying to rebuild a life that was shattered by unimaginable betrayal. She hasn't spoken directly to Nicholas since his arrest, and says there's no point in responding to apologies she was never meant to hear. "In my mind, I am supposed to be dead," she explained, "and so I'm a ghost, and ghosts can't speak." When asked if she still loves her son, she replied with heartbreaking honesty, "I love the person I knew to be my son before this happened. I love that 8-year-old boy racing cars with his dad." She knows that boy is gone forever, along with the life she and Ted tried to build around him. The Ted Shaughnessy case stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come from those closest to us. A successful businessman who spent his life helping others celebrate love through jewelry lost his life due to the actions of his own son, who valued money more than family. For Corey Shaughnessy, who survived that terrifying night, the greatest tragedy isn't just the loss of her husband, but the loss of the son she thought she knew. Her courage in speaking out and seeking justice ensures that Ted's memory lives on, while serving as a warning about the devastating consequences of greed and the ultimate price of betrayal within a family. The heartbreaking loss of Gannon Storch. 11-year-old Gannon Storch was born 4 months premature on September 29, 2008, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Despite his early arrival into the world, he grew into a bright and loving boy who dreamed of becoming a YouTube gamer. His father, Al Storch, described him as someone who absolutely loved his mom and had developed a similar affection for his stepmother, Letitia. Gannon was known as a mama's boy with a heart full of love for his family. The Storch family lived in the Lawson Ranch neighborhood southeast of Colorado Springs, where Gannon was preparing to enter 6th grade. His parents, Al and Letitia Storch, appeared to have a blended household, though their relationship would later reveal troubling complexities. Al served in the National Guard, which required him to be away for extended periods for military training and deployments. During these absences, Letitia was responsible for caring for Gannon and managing the household. However, beneath the surface of what seemed like a typical family life, tensions were brewing between Al and Letitia. According to Al's later testimony, Letitia had filed a claim of inappropriate behavior related to someone Al was serving with during his National Guard duties, which resulted in his transfer to Colorado. Additionally, she had told him she was pregnant when it wasn't true, adding strain to their relationship. Al would later describe Letitia as manipulative, though at the time, he tried to maintain stability for Gannon's sake. On January 27, 2020, what started as an ordinary Monday would become the beginning of a nightmare that would captivate the nation. Al was away in Oklahoma for National Guard training when the unthinkable happened. That morning, Letitia sent Al photos of Gannon in bed, claiming the boy was feeling unwell and wouldn't be attending school. Something about these images troubled Al later when he reflected on them during the trial. The blankets appeared unusual, piled in a way that didn't seem normal for Gannon, and there was a blanket that the boy typically didn't use. The bed itself was pulled away from the wall, which struck Al as strange. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera would later reveal crucial evidence about that fateful morning. The video showed Letitia leaving the family home with Gannon in her truck around 10. 2:15 a.m. The cameras captured them returning around 2:19 p.m., but investigators would later determine this was the last time Gannon would be seen alive. What happened during those hours would become central to understanding the tragedy that befell this innocent child. That afternoon, between 3:15 and 4:00 p.m., Letitia called the El Paso County Sheriff's Office to report that Gannon had left home to walk to a friend's house, but never returned. The initial report described him as a juvenile runaway, but this classification would soon change as investigators gathered more information. When the dispatcher asked who was the last person to see Gannon alive, Letitia's response would later haunt everyone who heard it. "I guess me." Al received the devastating news about his son's disappearance that Monday evening while he was still in Oklahoma. He immediately made arrangements to fly home, desperate to help find Gannon. When Letitia picked him up from the airport, Al noticed something peculiar that would stick with him. She had rented a car to come get him, explaining that she was worried about putting miles on her own vehicle. Al found this reasoning strange, thinking that in an emergency situation involving a missing child, concerns about car mileage seemed misplaced. She told him she had left her car at French Elementary School in Security Whitefield, where she worked at the time. Within 3 days of Gannon's disappearance, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office reclassified his case from a juvenile runaway to a missing or endangered person. This change reflected new information and evidence that suggested something far more serious had occurred. The search for Gannon mobilized an unprecedented response from law enforcement and the community. The FBI Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the Colorado Springs Police Department joined forces with the Sheriff's Office. Search teams deployed every available resource in their efforts to find Gannon. Drones scanned vast areas from above, while trained dogs followed scent trails on the ground. Helicopters circled overhead, and divers searched bodies of water, all in hopes of finding any trace of the missing boy. Horses carried searchers through difficult terrain, and hundreds of volunteers combed through various areas of interest. The community rallied together, with thousands of hours devoted to the investigation and hundreds of tips pouring in from concerned citizens. Gannon's biological parents made emotional pleas to the public, begging for their son's safe return and expressing gratitude for the overwhelming community support. The pain in their voices was evident as they held on to hope while fearing the worst. Their desperate appeals touched hearts across the nation as families everywhere could imagine the anguish of not knowing what had happened to their child. As the investigation progressed, investigators began focusing their attention on the events of January 27th and the inconsistencies in Letitia's accounts. She told Al different versions of what had happened to Gannon, changing her story multiple times. In one phone call, which was later wiretapped by the FBI, she claimed that she and Gannon had been followed by a man in a red vehicle who then took her stepson. She gave the alleged kidnapper 2 different names in her account, adding to the confusion. In another conversation, she told Al that Gannon had been riding his bike, fallen off, and gotten hurt. The stories became increasingly elaborate and contradictory. Letitia claimed that 2 different men had harmed her and then abducted Gannon. Later, she alleged that one of these men had taken Gannon after the boy had injured himself in a bicycle accident. Each new version of events raised more questions than answers, and investigators grew increasingly suspicious of her changing narratives. On March 2, 2020, more than a month after Gannon's disappearance, Letitia Storch was arrested in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She was charged with first-degree murder of a child by a person in a position of trust, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. The arrest brought a mix of relief and devastating confirmation to those who had hoped for Gannon's safe return. 2 weeks after Letitia's arrest, on March 17, 2020, the search for Gannon came to a tragic end. A maintenance worker discovered human remains under the Escambia Bay Bridge in Pace, Florida. more than 1,300 miles away from Gannon's Colorado home. The discovery location was significant, as investigators had learned that Letitia had traveled to the Florida Panhandle shortly after Gannon's disappearance. The remains were later confirmed to be those of 11-year-old Gannon Storch. The arrest affidavit, released on May 5, 2020, revealed deeply troubling details of what investigators believed had happened to Gannon. According to the document, Letitia had taken his life in his own bedroom on January 27, 2020. The young boy had endured multiple forms of harm before losing his life. The bedroom where Gannon should have felt safe had instead become the setting of unimaginable tragedy. After the tragic events, investigators believe Letitia spent considerable time trying to hide what had happened. She placed Gannon's body in a suitcase, along with other items from his room. The methodical nature of her actions after the fact would later become central to the prosecution's argument that she knew her actions were wrong. Forensic evidence would later show that investigators found traces connecting both Gannon and Letitia to key objects in the case. The cause of death was listed as a combination of severe injuries. Investigators theorized that Letitia had initially left Gannon's remains in a remote location north of Colorado Springs before retrieving them later. She then transporting them to Florida using a rented van, ultimately leaving the suitcase under the bridge where it was eventually discovered. The trial of Letitia Storch began on April 3, 2023, more than 3 years after Gannon's disappearance. She had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming she suffered from dissociative identity disorder due to childhood experiences. Her defense team argued that she had experienced a major psychotic crack as a result of past trauma when she took Gannon's life. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Allen, painted a different picture. They argued that Letitia's actions after the tragedy showed deliberate intent to cover up her crimes. Allen told the jury that she had taken conscious steps to hide what she had done, cleaning up evidence, moving Gannon's body to various locations, and ultimately disposing of it, like garbage, in hopes it would never be found. The prosecution emphasized that her ability to plan and execute a cover-up demonstrated her awareness that her actions were wrong. Al Storch was the first witness to testify in his ex-wife's murder trial. His testimony was emotional as he described Gannon's premature birth and the love his son had shown for his family. He spoke about how Gannon had dreamed of becoming a YouTube gamer and had been a mama's boy who loved both his biological mother and stepmother. The pain in Al's voice was evident as he recounted the last conversations he had with Letitia and the inconsistencies in her stories. During the trial, prosecutors played recorded phone calls between Al and Letitia from the days after Gannon's disappearance. These recordings, which had been wiretapped by the FBI, revealed Letitia's changing accounts of what had happened to Gannon. The jury heard her voice as she told different versions of events, each more elaborate and contradictory than the last. One particularly concerning piece of evidence was a video recording made by Letitia before the tragedy occurred. While Gannon couldn't be seen in the video, his voice could be heard crying and expressing concern about burns he had sustained. The audio captured Letitia talking about a fire and mentioning having to sell items, providing context for injuries Gannon had suffered. This evidence suggested that there had been troubling incidents in the household before the fatal day. The prosecution also presented testimony from various witnesses who had interacted with Letitia after Gannon's disappearance. Janine Sanchez, who worked with Letitia's daughter Harley, testified about picking Letitia up from the hospital on January 29. According to Sanchez, Letitia had jokingly said, "Hope you don't think we're a bunch of killers," when she got in the car. Sanchez found Letitia's behavior strange, particularly when she sent a text from the back seat asking if she could stay at Sanchez's home, even though all 3 women were in the car together. Another witness, Shauna Mobley, testified about text messages she had received from Letitia nearly a month after Gannon's disappearance. In these messages, Letitia asked for help finding a witness, who could say they saw someone leaving the Storch home with a suitcase on the night Gannon vanished. One text from Letitia read simply, "I need a witness." She also shared a story about someone breaking into their home, harming her, and taking Gannon. The defense presented their case around Letitia's mental state, calling Dr. Dorothy Otno-Lewis as their primary witness. Dr. Lewis, a controversial psychiatrist who specializes in dissociative identity disorder, testified that she believed Letitia had multiple personalities. She claimed to have met one of these personalities, whom she referred to as Maria. The defense argued that Letitia was not in control of her actions due to this mental condition. However, the prosecution's case included testimony from state psychiatrists who had evaluated Letitia and found her competent to stand trial. Law enforcement officers testified about their interactions with Letitia on the night Gannon lost his life. They described how she appeared to be laughing, joking, and seemed disconnected from the gravity of the situation. The defense pointed to this behavior as evidence of her dissociative state, while the prosecution argued it showed her calculated attempts to appear innocent. After 5 weeks of testimony and more than a day of deliberations, the jury reached their verdict on May 8, 2023. They rejected Letitia's insanity defense and found her guilty on all charges. The charges included first-degree murder, murder of a child under 12 by a person in a position of trust, tampering with physical evidence, and tampering with a deceased human being. As the verdict was read, Letitia showed no visible reaction, sitting quietly at the defense table between her attorneys. Judge Gregory Werner delivered Letitia's sentence the same day as the verdict. His words reflected the horror of what had occurred. "The facts in this case are the most horrific I have ever seen. Your conduct in this case deserves the maximum sentence that I can impose according to Colorado law." He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the 2 murder counts, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling 156 years for the tampering charges. The loss of Gannon Storch represents one of the most heartbreaking cases of a child losing his life due to the actions of someone who was supposed to protect him. His story touched millions of people across the nation who followed the search efforts and trial proceedings. The 11-year-old boy who dreamed of being a YouTube gamer and loved his family unconditionally will be remembered not for the tragic way his life ended, but for the joy he brought to those who knew him and the lasting impact his story has had on efforts to protect other children from similar fates. The story of Tina Watson. Christina Mee Watson was just 26 years old when she lost her life due to the actions of her husband on what should have been the happiest trip of her young marriage. Born in West Germany on February 13, 1977, she came to America as a baby and was lovingly adopted by Tommy and Cindy Thomas on January 24, 1980. The Thomas family lived in Walker County, Alabama, with Tina's younger sister Alanda, before moving to Louisiana and then Birmingham. She grew up in a close-knit household where her father worked as an insurance agent and her mother provided a stable, nurturing environment. Tina was a bright, ambitious young woman who attended the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where she would meet the man who would ultimately become her husband and cause her tragic loss. David Gabriel, Gabe, Watson was a fellow student, and they began dating in January 2001. To those who knew her, Tina was a loving daughter and sister, described by family as someone who brought joy to every room she entered. She worked as a departmental manager at Parisian, a southern department store chain, and was known for her dedication and kind spirit. Despite being diagnosed with paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, a heart condition that causes rapid heartbeat, Tina lived life to the fullest. In January 2003, with her wedding approaching, Tina made the decision to learn scuba diving. It seemed like an exciting adventure she could share with Gabe, who portrayed himself as an experienced diver. She earned her certification just before their wedding on October 11, 2003. By the time they married, Watson claimed to have completed 55 dives, while Tina had only completed 5. The couple planned an exotic honeymoon trip to Australia's Great Barrier Reef, a destination many divers consider a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Before their wedding, something troubling occurred that would later become crucial evidence. According to Tina's father, Tommy Thomas, Gabe had approached Tina about her life insurance policy. Thomas later testified that his daughter came to him shortly before the wedding, explaining that Gabe had asked her to increase her life insurance to $130,000 and make him the sole beneficiary instead of her father. The caring father told his daughter not to worry about it immediately and suggested she tell Gabe the changes had been made. However, the policy was never actually changed, leaving Tommy Thomas as the beneficiary. The newlyweds flew to Sydney for a week before heading to Townsville for their diving adventure. They booked a trip with Mike Ball Dive Expeditions aboard the vessel Spalsport to dive the wreck of the SS Yongala, a passenger ship that had sunk in 1911. The dive site was known to be challenging, with strong currents and depths of 30 meters, yet the couple chose this difficult location despite Watson's limited open ocean experience and Tina's complete lack of ocean diving. The dive company offered an orientation dive with a professional dive master, but both Watson and Tina declined this safety measure. On the morning of October 22, 2003, just 11 days after their wedding, the couple prepared for what would be Tina's final dive. Wade Singleton, the dive master who would later testify at Watson's trials, noted that the company had violated its own safety protocols. Tina should have received a private briefing and orientation dive due to her inexperience, but these crucial safety measures were skipped. When Singleton later testified, he admitted under questioning from defense attorney Brett Bloomston that he wasn't even aware Tina had never been in the ocean for an open water dive. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Tina and Gabe entered the water together. Within 2 minutes of beginning the dive, something went terribly wrong. According to Watson's account, which would change multiple times over the coming months, the currents were stronger than expected. He claimed Tina signaled that she wanted to return to the dive rope, and when they reached it, he noticed a worried expression on her face. Watson said she accidentally knocked his mask and air regulator loose, and by the time he recovered his sight, Tina was sinking too quickly for him to help her. But other divers in the water that day saw something very different. Stanley Stutz, who was diving nearby, witnessed Watson engaged in what appeared to be an underwater hold with his struggling wife. After this, Stutz watched as Watson headed for the surface while Tina drifted downward. Another diver, Gary Stempler, was taking photographs of his own wife when he unknowingly captured an image of Tina lying still on the ocean floor. This photograph wouldn't be discovered until weeks later when the film was developed. Watson surfaced and climbed aboard the Spalsport, alerting dive instructor Wade Singleton that his wife was in trouble. Singleton immediately descended and brought Tina back up after she had been underwater for 10 minutes. She was transferred to the adjacent dive boat Jazz II, where a doctor worked desperately for 40 minutes trying to revive her. Throughout this rescue effort, Watson remained on the Spalsport, not joining the attempts to help. Despite all efforts, Tina could not be revived. The following day, Professor David Williams, consultant forensic pathologist to the Queensland coroner, examined Tina's condition. Williams found clear evidence of air embolism, but no degenerative disease. He determined the cause of death to be drowning. When Williams later testified before the Alabama jury, showing autopsy photographs, Tina's father, Tommy Thomas, left the courtroom in tears, unable to bear seeing the evidence of what had happened to his beloved daughter. The unusual circumstances surrounding Tina's passing and Watson's conflicting statements immediately raised suspicions among Australian authorities. A coronial inquiry was launched, as is standard practice in Australia. Watson had already left the country by this point and declined to return, instead providing evidence through his lawyers. During the inquest, prosecutors presented evidence that Watson's story contradicted the data recorded by his dive computer. They suggested he may have turned off Tina's regulator and held her until she lost consciousness, then turned the air back on and allowed her to sink before surfacing. The investigation revealed troubling details about Watson's behavior following his wife's loss. When Tina was brought to the surface, her regulator was still in her mouth, her tank still contained air, and tests showed no equipment malfunctions. Watson, who claimed to be a certified rescue diver, had made no attempt to inflate Tina's buoyancy control device or remove her weight belt, basic rescue procedures that could have saved her life. Crown Prosecutor Brendan Campbell noted that Watson had given police 16 different versions of what happened that day, none of which matched eyewitness accounts. Back in Alabama, Tina's family was struggling with their devastating loss. Her sister Alanda Thomas would later provide emotional testimony about Watson's behavior during this period. She recalled that Watson told her he wanted to claim Tina's personal belongings before the viewing at the funeral home. He told me that I needed to realize that he had his time in Australia to grieve, and he was over the grieving process, Thomas testified, her voice breaking as she glanced at her former brother-in-law across the courtroom. Watson explained that he knew the Thomas family needed more time to grieve, but he had already moved past his sorrow. The funeral was held just 2 weeks after Tina's passing. Adding to the family's grief, Watson's actions regarding Tina's final resting place were deeply unsettling. After Tina was buried in Pelham, Alabama, Watson had her remains moved in 2007 to a different lot that he had purchased. When family members reported that flowers and gifts were repeatedly disappearing from the grave site, even when chained down, police installed surveillance cameras. The footage revealed Watson removing these tributes with bolt cutters and throwing them in trash cans. Watson later claimed he removed them because they were big, gaudy, plastic arrangements. Her grave remained unmarked until 2009, when Watson finally provided a simple foot marker. The legal proceedings began in Australia, where Watson was charged in connection with Tina's loss. On June 19, 2008, the Queensland coroner formally charged Watson with the offence at the site of the historical shipwreck Yongala. After resisting extradition for 6 months, Watson voluntarily returned to Australia in May 2009 to face trial. On June 5, 2009, in a surprising turn of events, Watson pleaded not guilty to the most serious charge, but guilty to manslaughter. Crown Prosecutor Brendan Campbell presented a compelling case, highlighting how Watson, despite being trained in rescue diving, had allowed his wife to sink to the ocean floor without making any serious attempt to save her. The prosecutor emphasized that Watson had failed completely in his duties as Tina's dive buddy, neglecting to share his alternative air source or take any of the basic rescue actions that could have prevented her loss. Watson was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, but would serve only 12 months before being released. The lenient sentence outraged Tina's family, who called the 12-month term an embarrassment to Australia. Alabama Attorney General Troy King immediately lodged an appeal, and Queensland's Director of Public Prosecutions also appealed the inadequate sentence. The appeal was heard on July 17, 2009, with the Crown requesting an increase to 2.5 years. On September 18, 2009, 2 justices allowed the prosecution's appeal, increasing Watson's incarceration by 6 months to a total of 18 months. While Watson served his time in Australia, Alabama authorities were building their own case. In May 2010, Attorney General Troy King announced his intention to try Watson for capital charges and kidnapping, asserting jurisdiction based on the theory that the alleged crime was planned in Alabama. The kidnapping charge was particularly significant, as prosecutors argued Watson had deceived Tina into traveling to Australia with the intent to harm her. Key evidence emerged about Watson's possible financial motives. Cesar LaMonica, a manager at the store where Tina worked, testified that Watson had come in within a month of her loss, asking about a life insurance policy. However, the defense argued that Watson had no financial motive because Tina's father, not Watson, was the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. The prosecution maintained that Watson believed he would inherit substantial money, estimating the potential gain at over $200,000. Watson was released from Australian prison on November 10, 2010, and immediately deported to the United States, where he was arrested upon landing in Los Angeles. He appeared before an Alabama judge on December 15, 2010, requesting bail. Judge Tommy Nail set bond at $100,000, requiring Watson to wear a monitoring device, surrender his passport, remain in Alabama, and observe a sundown to sunrise curfew. When bail was granted, Watson's supporters in the packed courtroom rose and cheered, prompting Judge Nail to respond sternly, sit down. This is not a spectator sport." On January 31, 2011, Watson appeared before Judge Nail to formally answer 2 charges: kidnapping Tina and taking her to Australia with harmful intent, and the scuba diving incident itself on the Great Barrier Reef. He pleaded not guilty to both charges. The trial was initially set for May 23, 2011, but was later moved to February 13, 2012, due to security concerns. As the Alabama trial approached, new evidence emerged that complicated the case. Colin McKenzie, a key diving expert who had initially maintained that a diver with Watson's training should have been able to bring Tina up, later retracted much of his testimony. After being provided with Tina and Watson's complete diving logs, certificates, and medical histories, McKenzie concluded that Watson should never have been allowed in the water as Tina's dive buddy. The expert revealed that Watson had received his rescue certification after completing only a 2-day course in an Alabama quarry, when it normally required 4 days. McKenzie ultimately stated he had no hope of being competent. He could barely save himself that day, let alone his wife. I don't believe he intended to harm her. Professor Michael Bennett, a leading expert in dive medicine, provided crucial testimony about Tina's fitness to dive. He noted that Tina had undergone heart surgery 2 years earlier to correct an irregular heartbeat, but had falsely stated on her dive application that she had never had heart problems or surgery. Bennett concluded that Tina was unfit to dive without clearance from a cardiologist. The Alabama trial began on February 13, 2012, with opening statements from both sides. Assistant Alabama Attorney General Andrew Arrington told the jury that the case was not just about losing a life, but losing a life for financial gain. He alleged that Watson had deliberately interfered with Tina's air supply and held her until she could no longer respond. He took her engagement ring as his last act of contact with her on this earth, Arrington dramatically told the jury. The prosecution showed jurors the underwater photograph taken by Gary Stempler, depicting Watson swimming to the surface while his wife lay motionless on the ocean floor. The prosecution's case, however, began to unravel almost immediately. Judge Tommy Nail made several crucial rulings that severely limited the evidence prosecutors could present. Most significantly, Nail ruled that evidence of Watson's behavior following Tina's loss was inadmissible. The judge also blocked Tommy Thomas from testifying about Watson's alleged attempts to increase Tina's life insurance, ruling the statement inadmissible as hearsay. Tommy Thomas did take the stand, providing emotional testimony about his interactions with Watson following Tina's passing. He told the court that Watson had given him conflicting accounts of what happened underwater. Initially, Watson told Thomas by phone that Tina had given him a thumbs-up signal, which he interpreted as wanting to surface. Months later, when Thomas asked why Watson didn't take her to the surface after the thumbs-up signal, Watson changed his story, claiming it meant she wanted to go to the anchor line. Thomas also testified that Watson had told him he was by Tina's side during revival efforts, and that he brought her back on the plane, contradicting what Watson told other witnesses. As Thomas left the stand, he looked directly at the jurors, though only a few met his gaze. Alanda Thomas, Tina's sister, provided testimony about Watson's unsettling behavior after the loss. She recalled the painful conversation about Watson claiming Tina's belongings and his statement that he was over the grieving process. However, Judge Nail severely limited her testimony, blocking most questions about Watson's actions and conversations as improper. The restrictions led to heated exchanges between the judge and prosecutors, with Nail pounding his desk and pointing at Assistant Attorney General Don Vailska, shouting, "You need to move on." When Vailska protested, Nail responded pointedly, "If y'all don't like my ruling, you know where Montgomery is," referring to the state's appeal courts. The prosecution's case continued to face obstacles as key evidence was ruled inadmissible. Prosecutor Don Vailska, who had 41 years of trial experience, later said this was the first time he had ever had a trial end in a judge's acquittal. Despite the setbacks, prosecutors pressed on, calling witnesses including Wade Singleton, the dive master, and medical examiner David John Williams. As the prosecution presented its case, it became clear that they were struggling to prove premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, led by Brett Bloomston, argued that Tina's loss was a tragic accident caused by a perfect storm of circumstances, including inadequate safety procedures by the dive company, Watson's insufficient training, and Tina's undisclosed medical condition. On February 23, 2012, after the prosecution completed its case, Judge Tommy Nail made an unprecedented decision. Without the defense needing to present its case, Nail dismissed all charges against Watson, ruling that the state's evidence was sorely lacking. The judge determined that prosecutors had failed to prove that Watson had any financial motive for causing his wife's loss. Nail's acquittal meant that Watson was completely cleared of all charges related to Tina's passing. Tommy Thomas, devastated by the judge's decision, expressed his frustration with the outcome. "It should have gone to the jury for them to decide," he said, believing that 12 citizens should have been allowed to weigh the evidence and determine Watson's guilt or innocence. The Thomas family had fought for nearly 9 years to see Watson face a jury trial for their daughter's loss, only to have the case dismissed before the defense even presented their arguments. The tragedy of Tina Watson's passing extends far beyond the legal proceedings that followed. A young woman full of life and love lost everything due to the actions of the person who had promised to protect and cherish her forever. Her family's pursuit of justice, while ultimately unsuccessful in securing a conviction, brought attention to the dangers that can exist even in the most intimate relationships. Tina's memory lives on through those who loved her, and their courage in seeking answers ensures that her story will not be forgotten.